Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a polar bear in pastels. Now for this I decided to start with my background first because it is behind the main subject. I find this makes it a bit easier throughout the drawing process. Now for this project I did decide to use just my pastel pencils from start to finish. Now the first thing that I'm working with here is just my white Carbothello pencil and blocking in my brightest sections of the snow. I can then start to work on more of the darker values and build up the depth in stages. Now I decided to use just the pastel pencils for this because it's a smaller project, only being a 6 by 8 inch. I needed to be very accurate with each layer. Now the pan pastels are a wonderful way of getting a base foundation in place, but being that the applicators we apply them with are that much larger, I wanted to make sure here that I was being as precise as I could when blocking in my main lights and darks. Now when drawing backgrounds where we want that scenery to look a little bit out of focus, it's really important to make sure that there's not any detail in that portion. So you can see here that for most parts I'm using the side of the pencil to help create that softness right from the beginning. Now being able to blend the pastels here in this way is one of the things that makes pastels such a versatile medium. We can use the pencils to create super fine details, but we can also very quickly adjust that technique to create the softness. Now at this stage of the sky, I was having to blend a couple of my pencils together to get the right colour that I wanted for this. Now it's not necessarily about having the exact colour here. In the real-time tutorial, which is all linked in the description below if that is of interest, but in the real-time step-by-step lesson, there are many different pencils I mentioned we could be using. It's whether or not it is a cool or a warm colour that I'm more focused on. But for example, there were 3 or 4 different cooler blues that I could have used for this. It's whether or not it's the right value. Now this is something that I talk a lot about in all of my YouTube tutorials because the contrast and the values that we use are what's going to build up more of that three-dimensional look. And this project demonstrates it perfectly because I could use many different blues for this, but if my values aren't right, then it's still going to look flat and two-dimensional. Now as I continue to work more on the top section of the background, you can see that the shape and form of that scenery is starting to take place. Now how I'm directing my pencils, whether or not I'm creating a slightly diagonal slope, giving the impression of that structure at more of an angle, this is the sort of thing that I do want to be focusing on. Now for this project I'm actually using a different reference photo for my background than what's in the reference photo of the polar bears. I wanted something that was more scenic with that glacier in the background, so this is something where I really need to be focusing on the perspective. I need to be making sure that it's like this is photographed in one setting. Having that natural flow from the background to the foreground and the subject is really important when aiming for realism. Now as I continue to work with my pastel pencils at this stage, you'll see that the colour saturation becomes more vibrant. The other thing as well is that I'm starting to work more with my darker values. Now the reason being here is as the scenery comes closer to the foreground, you'll find that it usually gets darker. Now by having your lighter values in the elements of the background that you want to look further away, it's going to help with that perspective. So by making sure that I don't have any real darker blues or darker values at the top of that glacier, it's already starting to look further away compared to the darker blues that I'm working on at the moment. And this will generally be the case for projects such as landscapes or seascapes. The land that's closer to the horizon is going to have less contrast, so you're going to have lighter values, and then as you get closer to the foreground, everything starts to get a bit darker. This is really going to add a huge amount of depth to the drawing. And it's another reason why at this stage here I'm coming in with more of my white pencils and just hyping up that contrast and those lighter values even more. Now when working on the polar bears, because this is a smaller project, I need to be making sure that I'm not focusing on adding in loads of detail. The face of this polar bear is barely an inch wide, so I need to be making sure that I'm working with the right pencil technique to get my lights and my darks in the right place. Now this is the main reason why I decided to use my pastel pencils, because it encourages a really controlled and refined technique with this medium. Now this is really beneficial when working on a larger scale because the control of the pencil that we're having to use here can be applied for our larger projects. When we start to work with more of that delicate detail on larger drawings, we've already used more of that control technique on smaller projects like this. Now, the other reason why I feel working on smaller drawings is so beneficial is it can really help with that feeling of being burnt out. If you do have that feeling, you're not really wanting to be creating, you're feeling a little bit disheartened, working on smaller projects like this that can be completed within a few hours but still achieve a very high level of realism is one of those ways to get back into that art zone. It's such a motivational method and overcoming that stress of always trying to work on larger, more complex pieces. Now, I love pushing my art skills. I love looking for creating more of that realism, and that is easier to do on a larger scale. But they take days, sometimes weeks to complete. So being able to have a project from start to finish within a few hours that still looks like a photograph is something that I find so beneficial. Now, as more of the mother polar bear's face is becoming blocked in, you can really see how having that control on the pencil to make sure that every light and dark is in the right place is helping to build up that three-dimensional structure of her face. Now, here I'm also using a combination of my warm and cool colours. So at times I'm going to be using my blues, and then I'm also going to switch over to my yellows. This here and how we mix those layers together is very, very important, because if it's done incorrectly, the blue and the yellow will mix together and create a green. Now, if you had an animal that was standing on grass, that would be okay. But here I wouldn't want any green in the fur because it's not going to work with the rest of the scenery. Now, when I work with my base layers, I'm always focusing on that mixing of the layers. Pastels are a wonderful medium to work with, and one of the benefits is that you can mix your layers together and create an additional range of colours. But here we need to be really careful that that doesn't happen. Now, if we are encouraging that to happen, then we need to be making sure that we are using the right layering process. And again, this is something that I really do cover thoroughly in the real-time tutorial, which is all linked in the description below. Now, when I work with my base layers, I am always focusing on getting a soft blend first. I don't jump into my details. I want to be making sure that I've hinted at my lights and my darks, and that I haven't got any harsh start and stop points. Now, this would be the case when working on larger scales and regardless of the subject. I personally feel that the base layer is an important stage that I don't like to skip over. Now, the other aspect that this project really focuses on is where the warm and cool colours should be positioned. So, for example, on the mother's face here on the left-hand side, as you look at the drawing, that's more typically your cooler colours with more of the blues. And then as we progress to the right-hand side, that's more of those warmer, yellower colours. Now, being able to isolate in the reference photo where the warm and cool colours go, this is also going to help add more of that three-dimensional feel to the drawing. If I was to be adding more of those yellows to the left side of her face, then I'm going to make that light source look flatter and more overall and generalised. Whereas in the reference photo, the lighting was coming a little bit more from her right, which is why the highlights on the right side of her face are brighter. But I wanted to therefore encourage more of that light source by having those cooler, slightly darker tones on the left side. Now, the other factor here that's really important is snow being as bright as what it is, it's very reflective. So this is going to potentially encourage more of that colour to be bounced from the water up to the lighter areas that surround it. So this is also something else that we need to consider throughout each of the layers that we add. Now, despite this being a smaller project, you'll see that I've worked on smaller sections one bit at a time. This is my personal preference in how I like to work because it prevents me from rushing through the layering process. Now, because building up the layers is something that I find makes a huge difference to the amount of realism and depth that can be achieved, I never want to be jumping into my brightest details first. I want to be building up that in stages. Now, again, this is why I'm really focusing here on that base foundation. You can see I've probably used 3 or 4 individual layers to get to this stage. But creating that base layer that's also blended is making these details I add on top look soft. Now, for this specific animal, that's what I want. If she had just come out of the water and the fur was more clumped together, I'd have to be working with a little bit more of that harsher pencil technique to have more of that definition between my details. But because the fur is drier, it has more of that softness to it, I really do find that having that base foundation as blended as what it was does have a big impact with the layers that are added on top. Now working on the cub, I'm going to be using all of the same techniques, but because this is much smaller than the mother, I'm again having to really control that pencil technique even more. Being more precise with my pencils, I'm working with a bit more of my sharper points so that I can see exactly where those pencils are landing, but still focusing on where my lights and darks are and where those warm and cool colours are. Now it is very tempting at this stage to start adding in details such as reflections in the eye or colours in the iris, tiny little hairs within the fur. But I don't want to be doing that here because it's actually going to make it look less realistic. If I was to be adding lots of tiny details on the face of the cub, there's just not the space to do that. The other thing as well is if this mother and cub were sat in front of us and we were the ones that photographed it, these animals, the way that their size is in relation to everything else, they wouldn't be up close. This photograph has been taken at more of a distance. So if that animal was in front of us at that distance, we physically wouldn't be able to see the colours of their eyes, detailing in the iris and so on. So it's about trying to get that balance right between the level of realism that we want to achieve, but making sure we're not forcing that detail, which can actually make it look, in terms of the fur, more wiry and less realistic. So it's really about getting that balance just right. Now a big tip when drawing fur that has snow, mud, maybe sand if it's a beach scene, if some of that is on top of the fur, it's really important to leave that for the later layers. So the example here is on the back leg of the mother, you can see little bits of those white specks, which is that snow where she's obviously led down, and some of that is stuck to the end of the fur. If I'd have tried to draw that earlier on in that base layer process, or even as I started to work with my pencils first, then that snow is going to look like it's part of the mid-tone layers of the fur rather than sitting on the top. So being able to isolate what layer to draw first can really help simplify the entire drawing process. Now when I work with fur, for the most part, I'm working from dark to light. There are exceptions if I've got a particularly light coloured animal or I've got an area of highlight that's particularly bright, then I will start off more with my lighter values and then darken them up where needed. I've got lots of videos here on YouTube that show different examples of that. And again, this project is another great example. So the highlights on the face of the mother, I started off with my white pencils first and then I worked with my midtones. But this just enables us to have that extra degree of control, and it also takes that pressure off. If we know that we've started with our lighter layers first for those brighter highlights, then we know that's as bright as it can possibly be. We always have that flexibility with pastels that we can darken it later however much is needed. But again, on the flip side of that, if we do go too dark with a layer, it's very easy to lighten it up. But the one thing with a portrait like this where the whites are so bright is if you do start with a darker layer, it can be more difficult to then brighten that up to completely white, which is why for those lighter highlights I will always be a bit more cautious and work with my lighter pastel first. So again, this portrait, it really does encourage all aspects of that drawing process: dark to light, light to dark, refined pencil technique, more of that control, and also focusing on that layering process. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in drawing along to the real-time tutorial of this or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. I will be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.